Okay, so hi everybody, and welcome to this first event of the autumn program for NISA. For those who haven't been with us on previous events or at the time of our launch, NISA stands for the National Interdisciplinary Circular Economy Research Programme. So this is a £30 million programme funded by the United Kingdom Research and Innovation Council. It's over a 4-year period. It started in January. And in the since January, there's been a lot of work going on behind the scenes in terms of setup, launch. It's the £30 million is spread over 5 national centres, and I'll say something about that in just a minute. I represent the Circular Economy Hub along with my colleague, Professor Fiona Charnley. So I'm Peter Hopkinson, co-director of the Circular Economy Hub. I'm based at the University of Exeter in the Business School along with Fiona. So it's great to have such an interesting and large audience. And we've kicked off the programme with a question that we are asked many times. And this is the first of 6 events that we're running between now and January. And the first one is, what do we mean by whole systems approaches in the circular economy? And what do we mean by systemic innovation? So if I can move my slide, that's always good. Just a bit of background is that the vision for the NISA programme as a whole is to accelerate interdisciplinary research, innovation and impact to scale up a UK circular economy. So there's a lot going on in the world, there's a lot going on in the UK. So this is a research-led programme that brings together 5 different centres that they're listed in the icons at the bottom of this slide to represent 5 strategic resource flows, not just in the UK, but globally. And I think we've got representation from each of them here today. So textiles, construction minerals, metals, technology metals. So they're little small metals, things like cobalt, titanium that sit inside many of the products that we know, and chemicals. And the objectives of the programme as a whole are listed there. You can read those at your leisure. And the Circular Economy Hub is a coordination programme to
Wonderful.
Oh, I'm getting a bit of noise from 1 or 2 open mics. If we can just keep the mics off, that would be great. And the hub is there to coordinate and collaborate with the centres to produce programme level outcomes and impacts, as well as support the delivery of outcomes and impacts from the individual centres. Why have we started off with this topic? Well, a key aim of the NISA programme is to promote system-level enablers and solutions to industry policy and public needs, including proof of concept and position to scale. Now, it's a bit of a mouthful. So that obviously leads to the question of what does that look like in practice? Well, the 5 centres who are represented in the programme each have a work programme that you can read about on their individual website or on the Circular Economy Hub website. And these were the guiding systems diagrams that each centre produced at the time that they were bidding to become a centre. And you can see they have a sort of a similarity as well as a difference in the way they visualise their particular resource flow from a system perspective. And the work that we're doing at the moment is looking at developing whole systems approaches and making sure that there's some consistency and commonality in the way we approach that particular topic. So the questions for today, there are many, but still getting a bit of noise. If someone's out there on a phone or in a noisy background, Katie, can you run down and just see?
I think it's Mahesh Patel.
Oh, okay, great, that's better. So that raises a number of questions, which we've given to Frank. I'll introduce him. I was just muted there for a second. So what do we mean by whole system solutions and systemic innovation? How do you do it? When you're sat in your room or out working with industry, or you are in industry, what does it mean to do whole system or systemic innovation? And what is the evidence base for whole system outcomes and impacts? They're really big questions for the programme as a whole. So it's with great pleasure to introduce Professor Frank Boons. We've known Frank for a long time. We're still friends, just about. And Frank will tell you a little bit about his background, but we couldn't think of anybody better to sort of give us a stimulus, really, about systems and systemic innovation from the perspective of socio-technical system transitions and transformation. So, Frank, I'm going to hand over to you. Stay off the mic, stay off the camera, unless we have a technical glitch. And if you can post your questions in the chat box and indicate whether you're willing and prepared to come in and ask that on the mic, I will then field those to Frank when he's finished in a few minutes. The slides that Frank's presenting, anything that I present, will be made available subsequently, so you don't have to scribble anything down. So, Frank, is that okay?
Yeah, sounds good, Peter.
Okay, so I need to stop sharing. Just a reminder that you can join us. I'll put that slide back up at the end if you want to stay in contact with us, if you're not already on our database. Over to you, Frank.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Just going to remove create this sort of the good environment for me here at home. It's still a little bit strange to do these kind of things from behind a laptop. It would be much nicer to actually be in the room with all of you. At the same time, I also know that this actually gives us an opportunity to connect with people that otherwise we wouldn't be able to do. So yeah, thanks, Peter, and thanks everybody at the CE Hub for inviting me to do this presentation. It's really nice and an honor in a way to be the person to kick off this seminar series. So my name is Frank Boons. I'm Professor of Innovation and Sustainability at the University of Manchester, where I'm also Director of the Sustainable Consumption Institute. And in addition to that, I'm Academic Fellow at the DEFRA Systems Research Program, so the ministry responsible for circular economy, you could say, or at least parts of circular economy in England and the UK. And then in addition, I'm also involved in one of the circular economy centers. So I want to keep this presentation quite sort of concise, because I think it's really important to have a discussion about these approaches, because even though we want to sort of, find ways of working on the commonalities of a systems approach throughout the program, it's also important to acknowledge that systems approaches have many sort of different forms and phases. And it's important to acknowledge that diversity, because that's actually part of the systems approach, I would say. So I've prepared my talk around the following topics. So first of all, I would like to say something about why we actually need a systems approach. And I think that's all about interacting societal challenges. Then I want to present a perspective for action, which is centered on the notion of system transitions. So the idea is that we have to look at whole systems, and those systems, if we want to change them, that's actually a quite complicated and long-term process. And that process we call a transition. Then I will go a little bit more in detail, because that notion of system transition has been applied to different kinds of technological systems. So the question is, can we and how can we apply that specifically to the circular economy and industrial symbiosis as a sort of subset of that? And then I want to end with a set of principles for systems-based action towards circular economy or circular economies. We can discuss whether it's better to talk about circular economy in the plural or the singular. I think that's also in itself already an interesting question. But let me start by briefly saying something about interacting societal challenges, and as a basis for actually sort of saying, okay, this is why we need a systems approach. And I'm not going to talk a long time around it, because I mean, we could easily spend the whole hour just sort of looking at this and sort of, even sort of listing the societal challenges that we are dealing with. So what I did is that I sort of took work that was done by the Stockholm Environmental Institute in 2019 in collaboration with the European Environmental Agency. And what they did is that they looked at how trying to achieve one of the Sustainable Development Goals affects the goal attainment of each of the other Sustainable Development Goals. So this is basically about the interaction between the different Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. And you can see that that interaction can range from enabling and reinforcing, or even being indivisible, to trying to achieve one SDG as constraining or even counteracting another SDG. So this, for me, is in a nutshell sort of, the challenge that we are confronted with. It's not just trying to end poverty or to improve well-being. We want to achieve all these things at the same time, but to some extent, they, efforts to advance one contradicts another one. Sorry, I'm hearing some background noise somewhere. This is obviously a lot of information, so I'm not going to go into great detail, but I mean, just focusing on two of the SDGs that are most related to the circular economy in the first instance. So this is sustainable natural resource management and the sustainable management of chemicals and waste. So that's part of SDG 12. Here we can see how trying to achieve those targets is a constraining factor on, for instance, developing sustainable cities and communities and reducing inequality. And also the other way around, if we want to advance sustainable cities, if we want to create affordable and clean energy systems, then that puts a strain or a constraint on sustainable natural resource management. This is based on sort of expert elicitation and literature review, and obviously there will always be exceptions to this, but as a general rule, you can sort of see that the SDGs that relate to the circular economy, that they sometimes have a very advantageous and synergetic relationship with other SDGs, but in several cases there's also a much more difficult relationship. And this is for me, sorry, this is for me sort of a key argument to say, okay, this is why we need systems approaches. So let me define a systems approach in the way that I'm going to use it in this presentation, and I propose that we try to sort of explore this way of defining it, at least in this hour. And if you want to explore more of it, then please contact me, because I'm happy to sort of talk about it, and I'm sure that other people within the hub and the centers are also very interested in doing that. So systems approaches in the most abstract sense are always about the interrelations between a set of entities. And very often a system is also sort of seen to have some kind of a function that needs to be fulfilled. And the fulfillment of the function actually happens through the entities that are interacting. So this is why systems approaches can be used in all kinds of sciences, whether it's the social sciences or engineering or medical science. The definition is so abstract that literally anything can be seen as a system. So we need to be more precise to actually sort of apply it to the circular economy. Before we do that, it's, I think, really important to sort of say what a whole systems approach is. And for me, the essence of a whole systems approach is about combining reflection with action. So it's really important that a systems approach is not just about making fancy system maps or matrices showing in the interrelations and stuff like that. That kind of analysis always needs to lead into action, and the action needs then to lead, you know, to further reflection and to sort of improve the maps, which then leads to further action. So that is for me a whole systems approach. One key element in doing systems work is how do you actually define the boundary of the system? And if anybody who has experience with this kind of work knows how difficult it sometimes is to arrive at a system boundary where everybody says, okay, I agree, you know, this is the boundary of the system. So actually going through that exercise is in itself already very illuminating and helps you to understand how other people look at the system that you are talking about. So for the purposes of this conversation and also the work that I am doing, I think that there are three systems that we are all part of and which we need to sort of acknowledge and work with in developing the circular economy. So that's first of all the socio-ecological Earth system. So this is the Earth, both in terms of its natural ecosystems, but also in terms of its human activity systems. The second type of system is the socio-technical innovation system. So that's really the system that helps us to develop technologies and the practices around those technologies that we use in our societies. And then the third type of system is what I call the political economy of provision. So this is very inclusively defined the systems that we need to provide for food, for housing, for mobility, for clothing, etc. So these three types of systems are really, really relevant, and we need to look at them. And in this presentation, I will focus mostly on the socio-technical innovation system, but I will try to make sure that we also look at the other types of systems as much as possible. So this is in a nutshell the definition that I'm working with. So then let us move on to the perspective for action, which is about systems transitions. And this is actually based on work that has been ongoing for at least 20 years, or maybe 25 years. And there's a whole research community which sort of devotes, most of their research time only to sort of developing the evidence base around this perspective, exploring it further, developing it in a theoretical sense, but also putting it into practice. So the European Environmental Agency is one of the sort of actors that has adopted this perspective. So the community is very sort of actively helping the agency to apply it. So I think that this is a really sort of useful perspective to start with if we want to explore systems perspectives. So what is this perspective about? And I will try to explain it as concisely and as quickly as I can. So basically, the idea is that we have a current system for our economy. So I'm looking here at the whole economy. It's a little bit ambitious, but let's try and do that anyway. So which we typically talk about as the linear economy. So what we see is that there are niches of activities which basically try to develop alternatives for that linear economy. So we have business models around circular products, product service systems. Cities are developing alternatives to the linear economy, etc., etc. So each of those are sort of located spaces of innovation and experimentation. Those activities, they develop over time, and some of them, they really take off in the sense that they are replicated in other places, or maybe the markets expand for the products that are the basis of them. And this will eventually result in the transition and the replacement of the linear economy by the circular economy. So that's basically the process of a transition that we are talking about. So part of this is about understanding how the linear economy stays in place and how it in a way resists the change towards a circular economy. Part of it is about understanding how those niches emerge and how they become viable and successful, because we have maybe 100 or 1,000 of these initiatives and only 1 or 2 actually survive. So is that like necessary waste in the innovation process, or can it be done more efficiently? So then by the time we have the new sort of, established regime of the circular economy, there will probably again be new niches emerging. So this is a process that will always go on and on. And then finally, there are always sort of events that happen in the background, which can actually influence the speed and the direction of the transition quite considerably, but which are not really under control of, the linear economy or the circular economy, so to speak. So this is in a nutshell the thinking behind societal transitions. And to give an example of how messy this process is, Peter asked me specifically to include this picture, which comes from another project in which we collaborated. The PRIF project, which was also supported by the UK Research Councils. So this is a picture of the timeline of the replacement of reusable sort of materials in hospitals, usually accompanied with sterilization, and how very slowly but surely that was actually replaced with single-use plastics materials and products. Again, I'm happy to sort of talk more about this, but I won't go into detail at this moment. But you can see that the different sort of colored events, you can see the legend in the top left-hand corner. There are different type of dynamics that actually sort of shape this development, which eventually leads to a transition from multiple-use products and devices to single-use devices. And it's really important to look at the time scale. So this is a time scale that, you know, that's actually over a century. So if we talk about transitions, then we are talking very often about these kind of timelines. So that's just to remind ourselves of the ambition that we have. So another way to look at this, and this visualization I find very helpful also for discussing this, is to think about the transition in terms of something that needs to appear. So this is the sunrise system, you could say, but at the same time also a system that needs to disappear. So that's the sunset system. And there are different phases in that process, which is basically the transition in our case from linear systems to circular systems of provision, which starts with promoting experimentation and innovation, but then moves on to disrupting incumbents. So that's really disrupting the linear economy, then further enabling the diffusion, and then also facilitating the reconfiguration and the phase out of the sunset system of the linear economy. So this image is for me really important in articulating that it's not only about building up something, it's also building or phasing out another system. And I included here also some examples of how policies need to actively support this. And you see that, you know, as the process sort of becomes more serious in a way, and the technology becomes, or the circular economy becomes more diffused, we actually need policies that are not strictly environmental or innovation oriented, but they are socio-economic policies, because they are about retraining people for new jobs. They are about regional assistance. They are about compensating losers. So that's a quite extensive sort of scope of policies that in the end is needed to make this happen. I will come back to this picture at the end. So up till now, what I've sort of talked about is really sort of generic knowledge about societal transitions. And, you know, I'm happy to sort of guide you to the evidence for, you know, for different areas of life or different systems of provision, if you are interested in that. I mean, we don't have the time to go into that in detail. What I do want to do is to sort of talk a little bit more specifically about the circular economy and industrial symbiosis, and asking the question whether that actually is a challenge of the regime of the linear economy. And I think we have to be critical to ourselves and ask that question, you know, is what we are currently advocating and developing, is that really going to challenge the linear economy? And of course we want it to be, but, you know, is it actually happening, and what do we need to make sure that it happens? So my definitions of these two concepts, because yeah, I know that people define them in various ways and sometimes in confusing ways. So for me, industrial symbiosis is about the networks of long and short-term exchanges of waste flows and byproducts between production facilities that are co-located. And co-located we can sort of here use in a loose sense, because sometimes it's within an industrial estate or an industrial park. Sometimes it's within a region where firms have like a waste exchange market. But that's the essence of industrial symbiosis, I would say. The circular economy is definitely more ambitious, I would say, because, and the way I would define that for the purposes of sort of looking at systems transitions, the circular economy is about the provision and human needs through closed-loop processes that cover production, transport, and consumption. So basically, we have a system for providing food or housing or whatever, and within that system, material flows are closed. And if we look at those definitions and if we think them through, and I mean, again, there's sort of research to back that up, which I'm happy to sort of share with you if you are interested in that. Industrial symbiosis has sort of a tendency to increase dependencies, at least a meaningful industrial symbiosis. And if you increase dependencies within any system, it basically locks into a certain state, and it makes it subsequently difficult to get out of that state. So in that sense, industrial symbiosis could actually lead to a lock-in of sort of linear or semi-linear forms of the economy. And that's what we don't want, yes, because if we want a system transition, then we don't necessarily want these things. So we have to be very careful in sort of working along the lines of industrial symbiosis, I would say. If you look at the circular economy, then the way that I look at it, this can definitely be part of the systems transition towards sustainability, but it doesn't necessarily always support and enhance that transition towards sustainability. So circular economy, it's definitely sort of, you know, we should definitely go for that, but we need to be quite careful to do it in the right way. And again, you know, that's where I think the whole systems approach comes in, because that means that we can't just say, if we circulate stuff, then that's a good thing. So we need to qualify that. So, and to give you, yeah, sort of the starting point maybe for the discussion, because I know that these examples immediately sort of raise all kinds of questions. Look at the different initiatives that are all self-labeled themselves as circular economy or circular economy business model or circular economy sector or network or city. And I think a really interesting question that I would love to discuss with all of you is, if you have all these different initiatives and they sort of evolve by more or less by themselves, do they actually make one circular economy? Is it the sort of addition of more and more of these initiatives that actually makes a circular economy? And you probably know that if somebody asks a question like that, then you know their answer is, well, maybe not. But I'm really sort of interested to hear whether, you know, what your thoughts are on this question. So based on this thinking, I want to conclude with a couple of principles for system-based action towards the circular economy or circular economies. And I think that there's a small set of principles for a sustainable circular economy transition that we really need to take seriously. And I would really defend them quite vigorously before giving any of those up. So the first of those principles is that the system boundary that we need to use needs to allow at least a consideration of the whole system of provision. So looking at individual business models, for instance, I'm not saying that that's not relevant, but I mean, developing the business model needs to happen within the context or supported by thinking about the larger system of provision. And the whole system of provision means that we look not only at the technological side of it or the economic side, but also the ecological, the cultural, and the political complexity. The second principle, again, I know that this is, you know, to some extent contested to say something like this, but I do really think it's important. Reduction of absolute levels of resource use is a principle for a sustainable circular economy transition. So that needs to be the objective. So any initiative that sort of says, well, we, you know, at a relative level, we are becoming more efficient, that's great, but that's not going to get us there. We need absolute levels of resource use reduction. The system boundary defines who should be actively included in shaping the transition. So this is basically a call for, if you look at the whole system of provision, then this also means that you need to include the users, you need to include civil society into those, into the activities that lead to the transition. And the process of transition, this is coming back to the visual that I used earlier. The process of transition requires attention to both sunrise and sunset activities. So we can't just sort of focus on stimulating the positive. We also have to think about how we phase out the linear economy, because that takes time. And if we don't do that, then we sort of create sort of a lot of social and economic unrest and basically organize our own resistance. And we don't want to do that. So my last slide, what I think is needed is, and please, you know, if you sort of use this slide or the information from it, please note the title, because what is needed is the well-integrated combination of the following things. First of all, up-to-date data on material stocks and flows in systems of provision. We don't have that data And I know that the NICER initiative is going to help us a great deal in getting that kind of data. But we need the help of everybody, that can help us to actually generate that data. Because if we don't have that data, we don't actually know the flows, and that means that we can never organize or develop and accelerate the circular economy. Secondly, we need experimentation, disruption, diffusion, and phase out. So these are the sort of 4 steps in this sort of sunset and sunrise picture, based on responsible innovation. So not business innovating by itself, or government sort of making decisions on their own. There needs to be an active and coordinated sort of process where government, business, users, and civil society, in one way or another, collaborate. And what you see here is me saying the market by itself will not help us to coordinate all these things. The transition, if we allow only the market to coordinate that, it will not lead us in the direction that we are looking for. And thirdly, I think it's really important to have a societal debate on sustainable provision that engages with the need for reduced consumption. And again, this is not, these things by themselves are really important, but I do think that we need to generate the data and do the responsible innovation and have the societal debate in a way that it actually interconnects. So the data needs to actually give us information that helps us to do responsible innovation. And the societal debate needs to feed into those processes of responsible innovation. So those kind of connections really need to be actively made by whoever wants to bring about a circular economy. So that's my very brief and concise introduction into the way I look at sort of systems innovation and system transitions in relation to the circular economy. Happy to take your questions, happy for you to grill me on everything that I've said, because I think that discussing this is so important that, yeah, I mean, I'm up for it. Peter, over to you.
Okay, Frank, thanks very much. If we can come back off screen share, so I might be able to see a few faces in the room. Just like to sort of welcome Fiona. Fiona's just hot-footed it back from the Isle of Wight this morning, so I don't know if she's there just to come in and say hi. She's the co-director of the Circular Economy Hub.
Hi, all good. Thank you very much. Thanks ever so much, Frank. That was a really inspiring talk, and hopefully will inspire lots of. I know there's some questions already.
Yeah,
that's great.
Great. So one question privately to me was, will your slides be available after the event, Frank? I think you seem to imply that they were and would be.
Yes, they will be. I just need to add some of the references, and also I need to make sure that some of the pictures that I use are sort of in the open domain. Don't want to get sued.
Yes. No, we don't want that.
But I mean, the information that's definitely sort of available for anybody to use.
Great. Okay, I'm just going to take a few questions that came in. I know Ishmael's asked a question, but I know that Ishmael is overseas at the moment, so I'm going to ask the question on his behalf. And I think you half answered this, but who decides what the system boundary is? And in particular, if you were thinking about extended global value chains, how do you bring in the global south and peripheral areas, which I think is something that Peter Oakley might want to follow up with subsequently.
Yeah, I mean that's a really key question, so my sort of one sentence summary of systems work is actually define the boundary of the system, because once you've done that completely, then you actually know the system and also have a course of action. So having said that, so everybody has system boundaries. So whenever we talk about providing for food or anything, we always have an implicit boundary of the system that we are talking about. So that means that everybody sort of is starting from their own definition. The kind of work that I am talking about is means that you have to engage with the system definitions of other people. To some extent, that is sort of a responsibility of anybody who takes an initiative. So, who are you affecting and how do you take into account those interests? So that's basically what companies call stakeholder management, or any label sort of referring to that. to some extent, it's also the interested party sort of actively seeking participation in these kind of processes. And I think there needs to be an openness to that, as long as the engagement is constructive. I don't know whether that answers your question, because there's no, I can't give you a generic answer saying, oh, go to these 5 steps and then you're fine. In the work that we're doing with DEFRA, I mean, this comes up every time, and there's always sort of the tension between we would like to involve a lot of people, but we don't actually know who to talk to, or we don't have the time to talk to them. So there's many reasons and constraints, pragmatic constraints around this. It's just that if you fail to engage with the people that you are affecting, then you might run into problems later down the road. Okay. So that is like a self-interested motivation to actually try to get it right.
So would it be fair to say that it should be explicit, it should be transparent, and it should be inclusive and open to new perspectives at any point in time?
Yeah, that's a great set of principles. It's always, the devil's always in the detail. Once you have, I mean, what we did in the DEFRA systems program is that we mapped the system in terms of its flows. And then we wanted actively to be inclusive and transparent and everything. It was still a hell of a job to just find the right organizations and people to talk to, and that were also willing to engage with us in this sort of systemic perspective. So
that's one of the challenges and opportunities for the NICER program. I'm just wondering, Peter Oakley's asked us a question that sort of picks up a sort of another angle on this. Peter, I don't know if you're there and would like to ask your question.
Yes, certainly. I'm intrigued about the fact with the you brought up the issue about dependency, because what we've been finding in terms of looking at systems, there are entire systems that look as if they're separate, but they're actually dependent on a more powerful central system. So if you map it in terms of process to creating a product, you see something that's quite contained. But actually, if you map it in terms of material, what you find is it's linked to other more powerful systems. So actually trying to generate or instigate change, you realize you've got a lot more barriers than you would have had otherwise. I'm not sure I can provide an answer for that, or even really a full question, but it's just your take on when you're mapping these systems. Do you find that some work better than the others in terms of encompassing that?
So I think that the method that I'm using is has sort of two sort of counteracting sort of activities. So one is to always try to be a little bit more inclusive than you previously were. So I always try to draw the boundary just a little bit wider and take in a little bit more context than maybe I'm comfortable in doing. At the same time, I try to avoid sort of the plate of spaghetti type of systems mapping and systems model, where basically everything is connected. So part of drawing the boundary is also saying, okay, these are really the key interactions, and you need to, that's why you need a conversation with different sort of actors in the system to actually sort of get to some kind of consensus about what those key dynamics and key interactions are, and then also weed out a lot of the detail sort of interrelationships that are there. And that also replies a question that I just saw popping up. Do you need like a sort of consensus on the system boundary? I think that one of the things that you try to achieve in doing systems work is to try and get more consensus, or at least understand sort of the system boundary of the persons that you are affecting. And that understanding, so that's a principle of dialogue, basically. You don't necessarily have to adopt the other person's perspective, but at least you need to understand where they're coming from. And you need to understand why they keep coming at you, with stuff where you say, well, I don't want to do this. You need at least to know why they keep on doing that, right? So I don't think complete consensus, complete alignment is possible or even desirable. But you should always try to at least understand the perspective and try to sort of see how it could be incorporated.
Really interesting, thanks.
Yeah, sounds about a bit like sitting down with your family and deciding where you want to go on holiday next year. You'll never get consensus. So I'm going to invite Mauri Craner from Zero Waste Scotland, and then Tom Nixon, and then I'm going to nip back up to Daniela and Henry, Levison, Gary, if they're all willing to come in. Mary, I think, and Tom's questions sort of follow on naturally from this conversation, but then we'll switch to Daniela. Is that okay, Mary, if you're there?
Hi there. Yep, no problem at all. I'm just bringing this back to almost like a real world perspective here. We all come from different backgrounds, different regions, different sectors. And in a real life context, in our own organisations, we always start with that, well, what does this mean for us? And immediately that boundary is in place by the organisations we work with, whether we choose it or not. So it was just to see if there's any perspective on coming for a whole systems approach. What does it look like if we take it from different perspectives? And has there been any thought as to whether it's more challenging to take it from, for example, in my world, a skills perspective and stream out to regions and stream out to sectors? Or is there a change if you start from a sectoral approach?
Wow, I think that's a huge question. Yeah, I really find it difficult because I think that the challenge with sort of it's very easy to talk about this in the abstract. It's very difficult to actually put it into practice. And so I do think that it's important to. So again, I hope you don't find this boring, but I'm referring to this program that we did in DEFRA, which I found quite interesting because it was really my sort of way of, in the UK, I'm originally from the Netherlands, in the UK, sort of learning how sort of within, that part of the government in that part of the UK, things are being done. This question is sort of, it's constantly coming up, and it's basically sort of, just working through that question in a way sort of already illuminates what you would want to do, and then putting it into action is really difficult. So I think that, within the context of policy making, there very often is sort of this desire to look at different perspectives, bring them in, talk about it, etc., etc. What I try to do in that context was always say, okay, if we're going to do a mapping, what are we actually going to use it for? Yes, because you have all these techniques like making a matrix with 250 cells, and then people get very excited about looking all the different perspectives and dimensions and how they interrelate. And then my simple question would always be, imagine that we have done the 2 months of work of filling in that matrix. What are we going to do when we have it? And if you can't answer that question, then it means that you're taking too much on board, I would say. Understand? So for me, that's, it's always a process of zooming in and zooming out in a way that you are doing, and that also is is true for how many dimensions you can take on.
Frank, just to add to that, Ishmael, who's our new postdoc for the Circular Economy Hub, he's got a background in complex systems science, so he's just put a post in about the work of Gerald Midgley at the University of Hull and the method of critical system heuristics, which I think is probably a follow-on event or a specialist event for those who are interested in boundary setting and context setting. So I'm going to move on because there's other questions that are coming. Thanks, Mary. And you made another good point, Mary, about the recent Scottish report on material footprint of Scotland, which everybody should sort of read. And we actually were talking about that this morning, want a conversation with you. So Tim, is it Tim or Tom? I've lost Tom Nixon. Did you just want to add a final comment about system boundary?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. That's great. I posted something in there just because the question came up, and it was more of a thought provoker about something about consistency and compatibility of system boundaries. And I'm thinking here the parallels to we have these terms, life cycle analysis, which is something I believe. So the big parallel to the whole system approaches there. So while I really think Frank has addressed this in one way with it doesn't have to be what was the word, consensus about system boundaries. I do think that there is a need to think about the metrics and the consistency there. really from a compatibility point of view. It often doesn't matter if you have every single input, but if everyone's doing it in a similar way, at least everything's comparable and things are able to move forward. So I'll be interested in Frank's thoughts on that. So you may disagree totally.
No, I don't disagree totally. So I'm really torn between on the one side the need for if you want to get stuff done, then you need to communicate, which means that you need to use indicators, etc., that are comparable. Sorry. So that's definitely I definitely understand that. At the same time, it's really important to, so that's why I sort of said, collecting data or putting together a database, you really need to do that in relation to those other two, addressing those other two needs. Every time you create a metric, you sort of are in a way sort of drawing a system boundary that excludes interest and excludes people from, sitting at the table and being considered. So that's why you really have to be careful in doing that, because if you create a metric, then you create it for a long period of time usually. I mean, just look at the way we do carbon budgets, how territorial emissions and sort of the emissions that are really sort of embedded in the product. The choice that we've made to go for the territorial one, it really sort of is creating huge problems, I would say. So that for me shows on the one hand sort of the power of the metric, because it has helped us to sort of globally sort of talk about the importance of actually reducing CO2 emissions. But at the same time, it has set us up for sort of not being able to address them in the way that we now know would be much better. So that's the tension that we have to deal with.
Okay, we better move on, Frank. Thanks for that. And the reason I asked you to put that medical device graphic in was to remind people about timelines and what happens when you start to embed, whether it's a metric or a product into the system, how long it takes to embed and then disembed. Daniela, and then Henry, and then Gary, if you're all there and willing to come in on the mic. Daniela first.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Peter. I'm really thinking about the definition that you had for systems that brings together reflection and action. And it brought me to the thought that, well, I guess we also need to understand what's the reaction of the system when we are integrating those new circular economy actions. And then here talking about both intended but also unintended reactions. And I wonder, how could we, in a very early implementation stage, try to understand what are both the intended and unintended reactions so that we can avoid to actually have a bigger negative impact in sustainability than by implementing a circularity initiative?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what we would all like to know, but so I totally agree with you that that's one of the questions that I think we are struggling with, in the center that we, where I'm currently involved, which is Tech Metals. Previously, we did a project on plastics, which is, we know that what the decisions that we made in the 50s, that we sort of, took a wrong turn in some respects, and that we could have, maybe done it completely differently. That's easy to say now. How can we avoid making those mistakes for the future? So that's where I would say sort of the body of knowledge on responsible innovation, and there's a lot of work out there that's just in the free domain, also by the European Union, by sort of the UK research councils, the EPSRC. They've sort of put together a lot of material on how to actually innovate in a way that you become aware of those unintended consequences, the negative ones, and try to avoid them and work to avoid them. So that's where, that's where I base sort of my approach on sort of dealing with that question. But it's impossible to completely predict the future, and it would also make it a little bit boring. So,
yeah. Daniela, great question. And Frank, you're doing remarkably well with these huge questions. Like, I was going to ask, what's the purpose of life as my question, but we'll leave that one for another time. Thanks, Danielle. We better move on. We've got about 7 or 8 minutes left before we can get to before we have to finish. So Henry and then Gary, if you're there. Henry first.
Hello, and thanks for letting me ask my question. When I was really interested in you looking at the question transition, and when I look at that question, I try and find external drivers, other forces to create a sort of coalition of the willing, if you like. And I've been working in the agri-food system, and there's quite a lot of interesting drivers coming from different directions there that seem to create an opportunity for change. I was just wondering whether obviously you're not covering that in this construction chemicals, I just wonder what the other external drivers are, which are not specifically related to circular economy as such, which you see as potentially offering sort of things that to link up with to drive change in different systems.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah. So I think there's, yeah. I mean, in a way, it's the usual suspects. I mean, we had a lot of conversation the past year about COVID and sort of, you know, building back better, which is now sort of appropriated, I think. But you know, in a way, has been used across Europe at least. So COVID is definitely an example. I think Brexit is also an example where potentially, which is a disruption of the economy, no matter how you look at it, you know, or your sort of ideological orientation towards it, and that disruption in itself can be sort of very useful in actually making changes. So I do think that those things are there, and they are, you know, we know about them. It's, you know, in transition language, it's how resilient is the regime in actually absorbing those kind of outside events. And what we see is that by and large, you know, there are some exceptions, but by and large, the regime is very resilient. And that's because we try to avoid at all costs sort of, you know, negative effects in the midterm. So that's why it's so difficult to actually, you know, capture sort of the opportunity that arises because of these kind of events. Not sure if I'm answering your question completely, but
well, I was going to put it back to Henry, and whether you've got a couple of ideas, Henry. What's your thinking on that? Because it's a really important topic in the food system. What do you see as potential external issues?
Well, in the food system, yes, Brexit and the new government direction to drive environmental benefits, payments for public benefits for public goods, but also, and the removal of basic payment system creates a crisis for smaller farmers. So their existence, they face an existential challenge. And in general, I always find, you know, based on behavioral economics, it's better to pick up fear of loss as a driver than opportunities. Opportunities can always happen next year or the year after or the year after. But fear of loss is a much stronger driver for action. Then there's also in the health area, there's with the pandemic sort of period of emergency food support beginning to tail off, there's a whole movement to think, what replaces this, and is the space to rethink the food system, because the sort of solution to food insecurity during the pandemic was just to use the current dysfunctional food system to provide emergency unhealthy food from the current system and make people dependent on food banks, etc., etc. So, and obviously there's also a drive around obesity and health and so on. So I think there's a whole range of drivers there, combined with, I think localism is key. And so there's the politics of localism are growing as well, with levelling up and so on. And so put those all together, I think there is in food a space for change. I don't know the other areas particularly well.
Okay, we'll hold it there because we've got 2 or 3 minutes. I'm going to ask Gary, and then I'm going to ask Aldo. Since he's in Sao Paulo in Brazil, it would be unreasonable not to allow Aldo to come in with this question. So Gary, can you ask quickly, and then Aldo, final question.
Yeah, Frank, I'm an industrial fellow at Cambridge, 35 years actually building industrial symbiosis systems, no waste biorefineries in the sugar sector. So I know what it takes to actually put things into action. 2 points really. The system boundary leads on to scope control, which leads into project success and action. Do you see a problem with circular economy that there is a barrier in the boundaries gets too large to actual action, it would make me shudder looking at trying to deliver a project in a CE context unless boundaries are drawn close. And secondly, do you have any good examples, real world examples of CE in practice?
Yeah, so I mean that second question is one that I asked myself, and I knew that somebody would ask it at some point in the seminar. And I think that really depends on your definition of CE, yes, because I mean there's people who say, well, industrial symbiosis is actually a form of circular economy, and there's multiple companies who claim that they have sort of put together a sort of their product chain in such a way that, you know, both the supply chain and the post-consumer chain are organized in such a way that, you know, that it's a more or less circular system. So I think that there are plenty of those kind of systems. Yeah, I mean, we don't have the time to really sort of, you know, go into an assessment of, I mean, I put sort of on the slides, I put a couple of examples where I think you could argue that in some senses they are circular economies, in other senses, you know, they still leave to be desired. In terms of, you know, is the system too big? Well, I think, you know, this is the ambition, right? It's similar to net zero. We have a very sort of encompassing ambition, and that's also why we can't sort of I don't think we can rely on the market to just sort of, you know, have bottom-up initiatives sort of make that change. It will never go exactly in the direction that we would want it. So it needs a more concerted effort.
Okay,
and that's
Frank, we better. I don't want to overrun because I know people will probably book their meetings.
Sure.
It's a shame that we can't have 2 hours or an hour and a half. But Aldo, if you're still there, sorry, Gary, to cut Frank off, but continue the conversation offline if we need it. Aldo.
All right, thank you, Peter. Thank you, and congratulations, Frank, for our presentation. Well, considering your first principle you mentioned as the whole system of ecological, technological, culture, and political complexity, how to integrate the 3 system models you mentioned before in the beginning of the presentation work, like socio-ecological, socio-technical, and political-economic of provision system. And just another one, and how we move from the physical resource perspective of circular economy to a really value to the value center of what circular economy can really and give to all elements, to all actors, to really measure the whole effectiveness of the system, please.
Yes, again, in
30 seconds. In 30 seconds, Frank.
And so happy to continue the conversation in another way, Aldo. A very quick reply. So the way that I look at those 3 systems is that they nested inside each other. So in that sense, that's the way I would think about them. I've always thought, but I still need to do the research to actually do that. But I think other people in the program are working on that as well. I think that the city context is actually very nice to sort of both explore and also see how those different sort of types of systems interact, and also how the different resource flows interact. So a regional sort of economy, so not a regional industrial park, but a regional economy is actually sort of a space where these things can very meaningfully be explored.
Frank, great. Thanks, Aldo. Thanks, everybody. What will happen next after the event was we'll write something up. Frank will see whether we can circulate part of your presentation. Several people have asked for it. Fantastic stimulus for us. Some of the questions will be followed up in our next event. So we're going to be running 2 big events of a longer duration. Hopefully you've seen those in the newsletter, and if you haven't, then contact us. I do have a slide showing you our contact details if I can get it up. So there it is. Do get in touch with us via those links. The next event is called Measuring the Circular Economy, which actually follows naturally from some of the things that Frank has discussed. And the one after that will be Creating Value in a Circular Economy. And both of those are explicitly related to system boundaries and system transition. So do join us again for those events, and then we'll be running some of these smaller, shorter events on circular economy design and circular economy business models and then a final session on circular economy roadmaps and transformational pathways. So that's between now and January. So thanks everyone for staying on board. We hit 95 at one point. We've kept most of the audience happy most of the time. Frank, you deserve a lie down now and go and have a think about some of those questions and come back to us so we can feed back in our note. And we really appreciate you giving your time. We forgot to say that not only are you a member of the Tech Metals Centre, but you're also a strategic advisor to the Circular Economy Hub on systems and systemic innovation. So a digital and a real round of applause. Okay, so thanks everyone. Good start to the programme. Enjoy the rest of the day and the weekend wherever you are in the world or the UK. Okay, bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.